Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 162 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, that is Fia and Gavin. And Fia, how does it feel to have your name go first?
It feels wonderful. Thank you for finally doing that.
Honestly, so I got midway through the intro, and I thought to myself, I don't have a question this time. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, feminism. And immediately, I knew what I had to do. I had to let Fia go first. So I'm glad that we got to have this moment together. Gavin, no one gives a shit about you. That's my one swear for this episode.
Dear listeners, you can't see it, but on the Zoom that we use to talk to each other while we record, Mike's background just says hashtag stay woke.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do
Nice
with that
job.
what you will.
A friend of mine described me one time. He goes, Mike, you are the strangest combination of super woke and not politically correct that I've ever met in my life. And it took me a second, but I was like, that's 100% accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That absolutely fits.
Spot on.
Yep.
And not in the way that you say slurs. That's not who you
No.
are.
One of our good friends, Riley, recently said on a big Zoom meeting that I was a little abrasive, and I said that was offensive, that I was only a little abrasive.
Yeah.
Because you're a lot of
Which, I mean,
yes.
If this is your first episode listening, new dear listeners,
well done.
Sorry that this is how you're getting started. We have 161 other episodes for you to listen to. Mike is on most of them, so if you want to,
he's really a nice guy.
He is.
I'm a delightful human, just
a
little,
not
politically correct, a little abrasive,
a little brash,
which is part of my charm once you get to know me. And if you don't know me, I'm usually quite pleasant in the beginning while I'm making sure I don't say anything too mean to a stranger.
That is true.
Anyways, this is not a therapy Mike session. This is a podcast where we talk about some dead stuff.
Yeah.
So we're going to do that. But before we do that, Fia is going to give us some housekeeping.
Yes. So, dear listeners, don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube to give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the pod. And if you'd like to be guest on the show, please be sure to fill out the guest form, and all that stuff can be found in the show notes. Gavin, what is next episode topic?
Yeah, so I mentioned in a previous episode, and this might have been something that editing Gavin did, so I don't remember if I exactly told you guys this. But we're going to be talking about Walking with Dinosaurs, both the 1999 BBC miniseries as well as the new one that just came out. And that one's just going to be myself and my wonderful wife, Liz. Partially because we're bulking a couple episodes ahead of time, because by the time next episode goes out, I will likely have a child. So,
yay!
I am not going to want to deal with recording and editing a podcast when I have a newborn baby. So, this was just the easiest thing for me to do. Because, Mike and Fia are both, busy people. So, I have a wonderful surprise guest host who lives in my house. So, and who I can make watch dinosaur documentaries with me if I want to. So
nice.
Does said guest in your house enjoy these dinosaur documentaries, or was this really you're going to do this because you're married to me?
No, well, it probably started that way as the latter.
Yeah.
But by the end, we haven't watched the new one yet, but we have already recorded the first one, the Walking with Dinosaurs 1999. And it is very memeable by 2025 standards. So I think she enjoyed it. She thought she had seen it before, but it turned out she hadn't. So spoilers for next episode. But yeah, so she does like documentaries. It's this isn't the first time we've watched dinosaur documentaries together. As they say, a couple that watches dinosaur documentaries together stays together. I think that's how the saying goes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I see no lies that are there.
Mike, do you have a Today in History?
I do have a Today in History. It's a super uplifting one.
Let's hear it.
Gavin correctly predicted that was a lie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 1947. What are we thinking about?
47. Probably the end of World War No, that was 45.
You're right. So you're actually right on both counts. The end of World War II was in 1945, but like we're still kind of picking up the pieces in 1947. And in 1947 we have the first edition of Et. I feel like it might be racist if I try and pronounce this. The first version of Anne Frank's diary was published in the Netherlands in 1947. Everybody's familiar with Anne Frank's diary.
Sure.
Originally published in Dutch, and then it's been translated into over 70 languages. There have been many other diaries that have been published like hers, but she was the first, and kind of helps to to humanize I was going to say survivors of, but victims of the Holocaust and other genocides, which when you've got statistics like 6 million Jews killed, it's important to actually be able to have some narrative to all of that. So yeah. Today in history, we have the first edition of Anne Frank's diary being published.
Wow, real downer.
Super downer, but I said it with a slightly cheerful tone. As it tried,
presentation matters.
I'm trying to go for a happy presentation. Speaking of happy presentations, Thea is always happy to give us a presentation. Thea, what you got for Seagrass Corner?
Seagrass Corner today, I want to talk about the spotted eagle ray, or Atobatus narinari. This is a Thanks. This is a cartilaginous fish of the eagle ray family. Spotted eagle rays they look like rays and they have a bunch of spots on them. Mostly they're seen alone, but occasionally they'll swim in groups. They're oviviparous, female retaining the eggs, then releasing the young as miniature versions of the parent. So kind of like a live birth, but like not really.
Yeah, it's like instead of everything is the same as if they laid the eggs, they just don't lay it, and it hatches in kind of a womb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So anyway, the spotted eagle ray, they like to feed on small fish and crustaceans, and sometimes they'll dig their little snouts into the sand and look for buried food, and it's really cute.
It's kind of adorable.
And then another fun fact about eagle rays is they just like to jump out of the water for fun. And there's not really a good reason for it. But sometimes that can be dangerous because there are at least 2 recorded occasions of them jumping into boats on accident and resulting in the death of a woman in the Florida Keys.
Yeah, and they're not small.
No.
I was about to ask what how big we're talking about here.
Yeah, they're... So I saw some of these when I was down in Belize when I was a senior in college. And they're not manta ray size, but that's a solid bowling ball just flying up out of the water at you.
Jeez. That's incredible. Glad we started off the segment here with 2 real uplifting stories.
Yeah.
All right. I told Gavin just actually, Fia, were you all set? You sounded like you were done, but was that everything?
You're correct, Mike.
Beautiful. Listeners, I told Gavin this better be a quick one because it's still nice outside. And I want to go and enjoy some sunshine. So, Gavin, let's get right into it. What are we learning about today?
I'll do my best, buddy. We're talking about brains. Yeah,
that's a quick one. Easy.
A famously simple topic. So, brains are responsible for, among other things, this podcast, and basically everything we ever do around us. But what exactly is a brain? How do they work? And where do they come from? So, first, as always, Mike and Fia, what is a brain?
It's like a bunch of neurons clustered together.
Okay.
Neurons clustered together. That's a good one. I think I like Thea's definition for the physical part of it, and then you've got to also talk about I think the function of the brain.
Okay.
A brain is a cluster of neurons that is designed to control and regulate I was going to say a multi-celled organism, but that's probably not the right answer. But an organism of some critical mass, that is large enough to be able to support a brain. Yeah, I know there's like gray matter and white matter, and stuff going on there, but
Yeah, that's a little more detailed than we're gonna get into here for the most part.
okay.
But yeah, there's different types of cells in the brain. Basically, in the middle is the white matter. On the outside, the wrinkly part, that's the gray matter. But there are differences. We're not going to talk about it. But yeah, so between those two things, you pretty much got it. There's one thing that between the two of you that you missed. So the brain is an organ that basically controls all the other stuff. It's an organized bundle of nerve cells that controls the senses, the muscles, and other organs. But specifically, it is located in the head.
Mm-hmm.
Once we get into some invertebrates, that complicates things a little bit. But at least, like, ancestrally, it is in the head. There are other bundles of nerves in other places outside the head, but those are not brains. But we will still talk about them. So, first, like I said, it's an organized bundle of nerve cells, or Fia called them neurons. What are those? What are nerve cells or neurons? They are a type of cell, like muscle cells or skin cells. However, they are some of like the strangest looking cells. The typical animal cell, just like the generic animal cell, is more or less like a sphere or like a blob. Some cells have specific shapes that help them do their jobs better. Like muscle cells are like very long and kind of stringy. Other cells have like little hairs coming off of them that help like move water or other liquids around. Or for example, red blood cells, they're really flat and kind of like a donut, but the hole doesn't like go all the way through, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Neurons have a very specific shape because their main job is to send messages across the body. So while your brain is made up of neurons, there are neurons all over your body. There's sort of the central body of the cell that has like the nucleus and the mitochondria and all the other parts of the cell that you'll learn about. But it also has two really important parts that other cells don't. Coming off of that sort of main cell body are structures called dendrites that kind of look like the branches of a tree.
Right.
Those are what receive messages from other cells. Then each neuron has, so it can have a number of different dendrites, but each neuron has one axon, basically a single very long dendrite that is what sends messages out. So it has lots of different ways or locations it can get information from, but only one out. And so this axon has sort of a coating around it, just around this part of the cell, that is called a myelin sheath, that basically kind of works like the coating on like a wire.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
To make sure I understand something. The myelin sheath, I feel like I've heard of that. Is that one of the things that degrades as you get older? It's one of the things responsible for aging?
Yes.
Or am I thinking of something else?
You're probably thinking of something else. The thing
Okay.
that degrades most that's like associated with aging are the ends of our chromosomes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. But there are definitely some medical conditions that can destroy or degrade this coating. Like multiple sclerosis does this.
Mm-hmm.
Guillain-Barré syndrome also does this. And that's what causes their various symptoms.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so this sheath, like I said, just kind of like insulates it and makes it much, much, much faster at sending the signals from the cell body down to the end of the axon, where it then passes those signals on to other neurons or whatever like the end of the chain is, whether it's like a muscle cell or some kind of other like a kid to your kidneys that tell them to make certain hormones or whatever, stuff like that. And so how neurons pass these signals from one to the other is some complex biochemistry that we are not going to get into. But basically, what they do is they build up electrical charges by making differences in concentrations of different ions from like the inside or the outside. So, for example, one of the most important of these sort of mechanisms is called the sodium-potassium pump.
Ooh.
So basically, this is why part of why salt is so important to like the normal functioning. So obviously, you can have way too much salt, but your neurons will preferentially like spend energy, because if they weren't spending energy, eventually it would just become equal concentrations inside and outside. That's just how nature works. But they spend energy to bring in potassium and kick out sodium, and that builds up because those are slightly differently charged. And you can do this with any ions that have charges, but this is a particularly famous example. And when they need to send a signal or produce some electricity, they will like stop doing that and like open the floodgates, and all the ions rushing to make equilibrium is what produces that electricity. There's lots of different ways that it can do it.
Right.
For example, this is on like a broader scale, how like electric eels make their electricity. Fundamentally the same thing. And this is also part of why you always hear about your brain needing so much energy. This is a big part of why, is because every time your brain sends an electrical signal, that is basically letting go of a bunch of energy that it used to make those different concentrations in ions. And in order for our brains to do that, it needs a ton of energy.
And this is like the need for salt and stuff. Like that's like if you are like on a long run or hike, you're expending a lot of energy and sweating. That's part of the reason why, like, liquid IV or drinking Gatorade or something is oftentimes better than just regular water to try and replenish,
right,
the salt and electrolytes.
Right. And this is also part of why you can be like overhydrated.
Yes.
Because then there's not enough ions in like the fluid around the cells.
Right.
For them to grab.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Can that be solved just by like increasing your salt content? Like, can you drink an infinite amount of water as long as you also have the proper amount of salt?
I mean,
infinite might be a stretch, but
your kidneys might be angry with you if you do that for long enough.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, kidney problems would be the first thing that comes to mind. And other like urinary tract things, but in terms of like chemical balance, yeah, probably. But anyway, regardless of exactly the different chemical ways they do it, the neurons accept a signal through the dendrites, pass it along to another neuron through their axon, the long dendrite, and there's a really tiny gap between the axon and the dendrite of like the receiving cell, and that's what's called a synapse. That's what, if you've seen Jimmy Neutron, you see him do the brain blast. That's what's happening.
Yes.
There's a little electrical charge going from one to the other, and that is how signals move across most animal bodies. There are a couple that do some weird stuff, but they're mostly stuff like sponges and things like that. But we'll talk about those a little bit later. There's also other things besides electricity that sort of move across the synapses. Like they're also constantly sending and receiving other chemicals like hormones and other chemical signals and stuff like that. But sort of the electricity part is the one that they're like most famous for. Obviously, there's a lot more to how neurons work and like how they know where to send the signal that they're getting. But that is beyond what we have time for here. Neurons, before we move on from neurons though, neurons are some of my favorite lines of evidence for like evolution and like shared ancestry, especially in vertebrates, because there is one nerve called the laryngeal nerve that controls some stuff in the upper throat, mostly like the voice box. You would think that, the voice box isn't that far from the brain, right?
Yeah.
All things considered. So you'd think it probably is just a pretty short trip for that nerve, but you would be wrong. That nerve stretches all the way down around the heart and then goes back up.
Really?
What?
Yes.
I feel like you're lying to me.
No.
Is that just in humans, or is that
That is in
every animal?
all vertebrates.
That's
All
a
of them.
lie.
Nope. And so, it is obviously inefficient. That is not the most direct route from your brain to your voice box. And it is comically inefficient when you consider animals like giraffes, where this nerve is over 15... this single nerve is over 15 feet long.
Yep.
That's hilarious.
And then even crazier when you consider things like sauropod dinosaurs, where this nerve must have been close to 100 feet long by the time it gets from their head all the way down their neck to their heart and then back up to basically their throat. And it is this way because if you look at that nerve in fish, which do not have necks, it is pretty much a straight line from the brain to the gills, where this nerve goes in fish. And the heart is much, much closer to the head in fish than it is in tetrapods, because like fish don't have a neck and shoulders to be in between the head and the heart. And so evolution can really only work with what's already there. So as fish came up onto land and grew necks and shoulders, the nerve stayed around the heart, and then eventually it just got to the point where that's just where it goes. That's just how development happens.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that is one of my favorite lines of evidence for evolution, is because if we were actually designed smartly, intelligently, this would not be the case.
Yeah.
Cool. So with all of that out of the way, so that's what makes up the brain and your nervous system, is these neurons. So onto the actual sort of brain itself. In vertebrates, the brain, for the most part, has three main sections: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So, imagine a brain. It's probably a human brain, because we've studied the human brain a lot, and it's in various media all the time. First, the cerebrum. That's the part that looks like a brain. That is the wrinkly part. It does most of the things that you think the brain does. This is where your senses are, your thoughts, emotions, voluntary movement. So like, even though nobody can see me right now when I'm talking, I am moving my arms around and stuff. That is voluntary movement, things that I am thinking about doing.
Sure.
Also memory, communication, etc. Most things that are voluntary, or like even like semi-voluntary, like thoughts, are in the cerebellum. Or the cerebrum, sorry. The cerebellum is nearly always smaller than the cerebrum, and it's kind of positioned underneath it. So if you are picturing a brain, it's got two little lumps kind of on the bottom. That's the cerebellum. And so the cerebellum doesn't start movement. That's what happens in the cerebrum. But its main job is like coordination. So this is where like hand-eye coordination, muscle memory sort of comes from.
Mm-hmm.
It takes in the sensory input from the spinal cord and sort of translates it to the cerebrum. And so it does a lot with balance, things like fine movement, so not just like swinging your arm, but things like playing the piano. Posture has a big part in. It basically fine-tunes the movements that are like started in the cerebrum, the top part.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the brainstem. This is sort of the top part of the spinal cord that connects to the cerebrum. As sort of that transition between the spinal cord and the cerebrum, this kind of does what you would think. This is like the main like highway for all the commands that the rest of your brain sends. It also does all of the non-voluntary things. So things like your heart rate, your breathing, unless you're focusing on like holding your breath. It also controls many of the nerves in your face and neck. It regulates your body's sleep cycle. It also, and like I said, just generally the interface between the brain and the rest of the body.
Mm-hmm.
So that's obviously each one of those three has many different sub-parts that all do various different things. We are not going to go into them. It is all very interesting, but very complicated.
Yeah.
I took a psychology class in high school, but it was like a college class. And like the first like third of the semester was just like learning the different parts of the brain. It is so complicated.
Yeah, that's why, people get doctorates in that.
Yeah. Yep. And so obviously that is, all of us were just picturing a human brain, presumably. But since different vertebrates, different animals have different needs, these parts vary in size in different groups. Especially like given the different subparts of the cerebellum or the cerebrum, the top wrinkly part. So for example, in mammals, the cerebrum in general is just generally very large compared to the other two parts. This is greatly exaggerated in humans. But different parts can be enlarged for different things. So for animals that are not very social, there are specific parts of the brain that are associated with, social structures and like communication. So like if you are, an animal that only interacts with others of your species for mating and never any other time, then this part of your brain is probably relatively small. If you are a human, where basically everything you do revolves around other people, certain parts of the cerebrum are very large. In reptiles, for example, the cerebrum is still bigger than the cerebellum, but they are much closer in size to each other than they are in mammals. In things like some fish and amphibians, the cerebrum is mostly used for olfactory senses, so like their smell, which in things that live in water is basically their entire body. So that is understandably very important to them.
Right.
And in sort of the most basal fish, so the most like quote unquote primitive fish, things like hagfish and lampreys, the cerebellum is proportionally much bigger than it is in a lot of other groups. And so even within the same group of vertebrates, the brain can be quite different. So for example, within mammals, so like picture the brain again. It's sort of got like a left half and a right half, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of a split in the middle.
Right.
In most mammals, the halves talk to each other very efficiently using some connective tissue in that sort of, split. That's called the corpus callosum. It basically just gives some extra lanes for signals to cross from one to the other. But in marsupials, they do not have that. They still have ways for the halves to talk to each other, but it is not as efficient as it is in placental mammals.
Weird.
Yeah. So even within mammals, the brain can be quite different. Moving on to the invertebrates, many of them do not have a centralized brain per se. Arthropods, so these are things like crabs, lobsters, spiders, insects, centipedes, stuff like that. They pretty much do have a brain in their head. It is called the supraesophageal ganglion. It's a mouthful. But it's not like as structured into the different parts as a vertebrate brain. It is, but not as like distinctly. So they have sort of two, like a left half and a right half kind of. And then they have a pair of nerve cords, so like one coming out of each of those halves, that run like along the belly. So instead of like our spinal cord being on the back, for them it's along their belly. and in each segment, so, arthropods, that's sort of one of their defining features is they have segmented bodies. So, like, imagine a centipede. In each segment, each of those two cords has what is called a ganglion, or plural is ganglia. I'll say either a couple times later. And a ganglia is just sort of a bundle of nerves, but it is not like organized in a particular way. It is just like a little hub, basically. They're kind of like a mini brain. Not quite, but that's the easiest way to talk about it. And so some arthropods have relatively few segments. Like insects don't have that many. But there are others, like millipedes, that can have hundreds of segments. And each segment has a ganglion on each of those two cords that run along their belly. Yeah. So they do have a lot of, nerves and things. They're just not nearly as centralized in the head. And this is broadly similar for things, for the annelid worms. So that's things like earthworms and leeches. Mollusks have a strange setup. Most of them do not have a centralized brain at all. The ones that have a head, so most of them besides bivalves, have a ring of nerve tissue around the mouth that has ganglia spaced like periodically around it. And this structure is called the nerve collar. That is basically their brain. And then in things like cephalopods, they're a little bit different. They basically have that same structure, and then their arms have a lot of nerves. Their arms are very sensitive. Bivalves sort of have this ring too, but like the ganglia are much smaller and don't seem to do as much. They obviously do like sense their environment, but most of them don't have eyes. There are some that do, like scallops and stuff. And a lot of them are light sensitive, but if you're not getting as, a lot of like variation in your sensory input, you just don't need as much processing power to sort of take all that in, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take another minute to talk about cephalopods here because they're weird. They're generally considered to be some of the smartest invertebrates, especially octopus. And in order for that to happen, they need to have a lot of quote-unquote brain for that to happen. Their brain-to-body mass percentage is higher than in most ectothermic vertebrates. So things like fish, lizards, snakes, and crocodilians. So like their brain makes up a lot of their body weight, like as a percentage. But it is still sort of below that same like number for endothermic vertebrates, so mammals and birds. They have a bit of a cranium, so they do have some kind of protection around their nerve cord, or their what I call nerve collar, to protect it. But their mouth is in the middle of it, and like their esophagus goes through it. So like if they eat something too big, they can give themselves like brain damage. Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah. Their nerves are also weird, just like the structure of them, because they don't have that myelin sheath coating on their axons. So you'd think that they wouldn't be as good at transmitting the senses and things, but they seem to do pretty well. We as in science, we've used their nerves in a lot of different studies because they tend to be larger than those of like mammals and things to better conduct the signal because they don't have the sheath. So they're just physically larger. And they're easier to like access. So they're really good like model organisms to study nerve functions because they're just bigger and easier to access because they don't have the myelin. Yeah. Moving on, sort of along the chain of different animals. Echinoderms, so these are things like starfish, sea urchins, and stuff like that. They're also really strange because of their weird 5-way symmetry. Being symmetrical in 5 ways is exclusively a them thing. And so they also just generally lack a head, which makes having a brain kind of hard. And so they also have a ring around the mouth like mollusks do. But the rest is more like a nerve net around the body, especially in things like sea urchins or sea cucumbers. Sea stars are a bit more organized. They have larger nerves that go out to each arm, but in general, they just have like a mesh of nerve fibers around the rest of their body. And lastly, it's some of the most simple animals. There's cnidarians, which are things like jellies, corals, sea anemones. They have no ganglia at all, just that sort of nerve net around their bodies. And then sponges, which frankly are barely animals to begin with. I'll get to more about sponges in a little bit because they do actually do some pretty cool things. But they don't have anything that even kind of closely resembles a brain. And so really quick focus on human brain, but it applies broadly to animals and to a lesser extent other amniotes. The human brain is comparatively enormous. Mammal brains in general are pretty big, but humans are insane. There is a measurement called the encephalization quotient, which is racist when used to try to divide between humans, as many people have tried to do, but it can tell us some interesting things when it's used to compare different species. Even then, it's not perfect, because certain parts of the brain are more important for, thinking than others, but it's a decent way to just generally compare brains from one species to the next. And so basically, there's this formula that's used for predicting brain mass for a given body mass. And the encephalization quotient is basically how far off, from the actual measured number. Basically, it's like a predictive formula. So if you put in, body mass, it will output brain mass. And if those two numbers line up between what the formula puts out and what's actually measured, you have an encephalization quotient of 1. They standardize it for some reason around a domestic cat. So cats have an yeah, I don't know. That the guy who made the formula was like, we got to standardize it off of something. So he picked a cat. He was like, cats are probably average intelligence, I guess.
God, all right.
But yes, so despite all the math, and please let me know if this doesn't make sense, if your brain is smaller than what the formula predicts, your encephalization quotient is below 1. If it is bigger than the formula predicts, it's above 1. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That part makes sense, yeah.
Cool. And so the formula is normalized because there are different factors. It's not like a linear scale, but and so here are some encephalization quotients for some various mammals, and we kind of use this as a rough, equivalent to intelligence as we understand it. So, cats, domestic dogs, squirrels, hyenas, horses, which was surprising to me, and brown bears are all in the ballpark of 1. They are about their brain is as big as you would predict it to be. On the low side, there are things like cows, mice are around 0.5.
Ew.
Adult pigs are around 0.4. And opossums are around 0.2. Poor dumb little guys.
Can you be a negative number?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Right, and like I said, this is not a nice linear scale.
Yeah,
so
I was just wondering.
Yeah. On the high end, California sea lions and gorillas are around 1.4. Elephants, red foxes, and rhesus macaques, which are a type of monkey, are somewhere around 2. Chimps and ravens, depending on exactly how you measure it and what population, somewhere, 2.4, 2.5. Most cetaceans, so that's whales, dolphins, are between 2.5 and 5.5. And then there's humans at 7.5.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Our brains...
Did you say 7.5?
Yes. Our brains are so much bigger than another comparatively sized animal.
I mean, this is part of the reason why, like, little babies have that soft spot up there for, the first year or so. It's like a reset button. No, like I'm saying, like, isn't it like, like the skulls can't come out, like, fully formed just to, like, to be born, right?
Yeah, that's part of it. It's mostly, there's also a different thing they're completely, like, unrelated. There's a similar formula that predicts, like, given an animal's body mass, how long should its gestation period be? So how long should the mother be pregnant for? Humans, and I think I've talked about this on the pod before, humans should be pregnant for longer, given our body size. But our heads are so enormous, and because we stand upright, if we were pregnant for any longer, then the baby wouldn't be able to fit through the pelvis.
I would love it if we could get Gavin's wife on the podcast to comment on that, but we'll have to say that.
No, she would hard disagree. She thinks the pregnancy should have ended, like this baby should have been born months ago. But that's part of why the baby humans' heads are so squishy, is because that was a solution that evolution came up with to have the brain still be big when the baby's born, but still have it fit out the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Is to just make the skull kind of flexible.
Yeah.
And so this encephalization quotient can be used for non-mammals, but we just understand mammal brains so much better that this is just a much more useful metric. And so these calculations, like I said, can be done with lizards and things and other stuff like that. Birds, it's a little bit more reliable too. But generally, this is mostly used for mammals. And then one last thing before we get to some fossils and evolution stuff. I'll talk about a couple brain myths that just bother me. So, first, reptile brain or lizard brain. Not a thing. They have all the same parts of the brain that we do. They're just different sizes. This is mostly referring to like instinctual things. So if you say like, in my lizard brain, I know snakes aren't actually like harmful to me. I'm not gonna get killed by a snake here in North America. But my lizard brain just sees a snake and freaks out. Stuff like that. That is not like a real thing. Lizard brains are, have all the same parts ours do.
Fake news.
Fake news. Left brain versus right brained. Not a thing. There's the, fun BuzzFeed personality quiz type thing where right-brained people are supposedly more creative and artistic, while left-brained people are more like analytical and rational. There's been lots of studies done and brain scans on people to see if there's anything to this, and there just isn't.
And yet people will continue using it.
They sure will. Fake news. We only use 10% of our brain. Not a thing. And the reason we know this is because there's no part of the brain that can be damaged or removed without some kind of adverse effects. They might not necessarily be lethal effects, but even just sitting on the couch, even if you're just sitting on the couch in silence, basically all parts of the brain are doing something basically 100% of the time.
Nice.
Fake news. Brain cells don't regenerate. Kind of fake news. This one is partially true. Some brain cells do not, but some do. And also, your brain is incredibly good at, if some brain cells do die, like due to like a traumatic brain injury or something, the brain is really good at replacing the functions of those damaged cells by adding new connections between the ones that are left. So, like, it might take some time, but the brain will, like, rewire itself to compensate for that missing brain power. Partially fake news. And the last one is that dinosaurs had 2 brains.
I've never heard that.
This is a surprisingly pervasive thing in paleontology. That the largest dinosaurs had 2 brains, one in their skull where it belongs, and one in their hips. Many dinosaurs, and also many animals in general, have an area in their hip vertebrae that looks like it kind of could hold a brain. And in the late 1800s, paleontologists thought that these animals were just so big that they needed a second brain to control the back half of their body because it was so far from their head.
That's insane.
Yeah. But basically the spot in the hips is basically just like an enlarged spot of the spinal cord for like big leg nerves to attach. No different than like how one of the biggest arteries in your body is your femoral artery in your leg. It's just there's a lot of muscle and a lot of stuff going on there, so it needs big nerves. And also stuff like whales exist that are bigger, and they don't need 2 brains. So fake news. All right, fossil time. As you'd probably guess, based on if you've listened to anything on the show before, brains being very soft and squishy don't have a great fossil record.
Oh my gosh. Shocking.
Wow, who would have thought?
How about that?
Yeah, you would mostly be right in that assumption, but we do have some evidence for brains, both from fossils directly, but also a lot of like good inferences that we can make from studying living things today. So we'll start with the living things before we get into just the small handful of fossil brain examples we have. So obviously, single-celled organisms do not have brains, sort of by definition. However, we do see that they have a lot of things that more complex life uses to build their brains. They still need to sense their environment, and the chemicals that they use for that are very similar to the ones we use. Presumably, this is because our shared ancestor over 1 billion years ago had this as well. Even, amoebas and things like that live in the oceans or whatever, a lot of them can still like sense light to a degree. And that's mostly a chemical reaction that happens like in the presence of light. And at the end of the day, that is like, if you strip away all the complicated brain stuff, that is kind of what senses do. They just react to a stimuli, and then the organism responds to that stimuli because of these chemicals.
Yeah.
There's also several types of fungi, like yeast, that have been found to use very similar chemicals to animals for communicating like across their colonies. And so I memed a little bit on sponges a minute ago, saying that they were barely animals, and I do stand by that. But, they don't have tissues like more complex animals, but they do have differentiated types of cells. So, like, they're just not, like, organized into tissues the way that more complex animals are. And so those cells still need to talk to one another, because the way sponges kind of function is that they have like holes all over their body that they bring water in through, and they filter all the different food particles out of the water, and then they expel the water out the top of the sponge. And so, but they have the ability to open and close those holes. So like if there's like a storm and the water is really muddy and murky, they can close up those holes so that they don't get clogged up on the inside. And they obviously need some kind of system in place for the cells to talk to each other to do that in like a coordinated way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most sponges do that just by releasing chemicals into the water. That's like, oh, I'm getting a little clogged up. I'm going to release a whole bunch of chemical A. That's going to tell everybody next to me to close up too. That is sort of how most of them do it. And that is a very, very basic version of how our nervous system works. Most people, like I mentioned earlier, most people think of the electricity part of synapses, but they're also constantly using chemicals to talk as well. And there's even a whole group of sponges, the glass sponges, that actually use electricity to signal for their cells to signal to one another. They don't have like dedicated cells or pathways like neurons to do this, but they'll just like kind of shock the cells around them as a signal, and they're like, oh, I just got shocked, I'll shock the people next to me, and it kind of ripples around the sponge, and that's how they will open and close their pores. And if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, because cells create these electrical charges by doing things that they're going to do anyway, which is just creating gradients in ions. So, we talked about neurons specifically doing that, but all cells do that. They might not be using that electricity for anything like specific, but that's just something that cells do anyway. And so this is very easily like something that could be like the starting block for how neurons evolved. And so based on looking at all these different modern, relatively simple organisms, it looks like all the most basic systems for communicating between different parts of the body are like very, very old. Probably to like the very first animals. Because these glass sponges have been around since at least the start of the Cambrian period, about 540 million years ago, and very likely before that. And so it's, it would be very unlikely that, these systems weren't around before the Cambrian when we start to see these more complex forms of life.
Mm-hmm.
You can also, looking at those more complex animals, make some confident assumptions just based on like consistent trends. So it's like if, think about like all of your cousins or something. If all of your cousins had red hair, you can probably assume that your grandparents had red hair.
Yeah.
Similar kind of situation here. So across all bilaterian animals, which is basically everything except sponges and cnidarians, which are like jellies and stuff, all of them have some kind of nerve cluster in their head or head-like part. Presumably, that's an ancestral feature since they all have it, like that red hair. So it's a good assumption that the earliest bilaterian animals had some kind of brain-like thing in their head-ish area. And so, generally, here's how brains are kind of thought to have happened. The first ever animals had to send electrical signals across their bodies in some way, like those glass sponges. Over time, as more dedicated organs and tissues began to evolve, those signals needed to be conducted better and formed sort of a nerve net, like jellies or sea anemones have. No specific nerve centers or anything, just like a mesh around the body that pick up information and tell other parts about it. As animals improved their senses over time, things like better vision, better smell, those areas required faster signal conduction, and, clusters of nerves sort of formed near those sensory parts. Most animals have most of their sensory organs at, like, the front of their body. Humans are weird because we stand upright. If we were on all fours, our head would be at the front. And, they have this so that they can see and hear where they're going, because most animals move forward. And so now, by this point, over time, all those senses and nerve clusters are like sort of concentrate into a head. And so now we have nerve clusters in heads where the sensory things are. Some of them that start to have limbs, like the early arthropods, also have some nerve clusters around the limbs to help coordinate them. That's sort of the different ganglia that, starfish and insects and stuff have around their bodies near their limbs. As different groups developed new features, they added or improved different parts of the brain. As early animals went from things drifting in the water to things swimming in, directions in the water, they needed better balance, so they further developed the balance parts of the brain. As we developed more muscular limbs, we developed parts of the brain to coordinate those limbs. As our vision got better, we developed parts of the brain to process what the eyes see, and so on. As life sort of came up onto land, our ancestors had to adjust to life in a more 2D world, since there's a lot more up and down involved in, like water ecosystems than on land. They also had to adjust to the limbs being more important and actually needing to use them to like walk and support your weight and things. And also there's a very big shift in what is needed for your senses to work in or out of water. So the brain had to adjust for those, new different types of input. Light and sound and smell are fundamentally different in air versus water. And then further sort of down the evolutionary line, as animals became more social, they developed parts of the brain to keep track of social order and social behaviors. Some things like birds that evolved to fly, had to rework and improve those parts of the brain dedicated to balance, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the general gist of how the brain came to be like a centralized thing in the head.
Cool.
However, most of that is speculation, like confident speculation, but speculation, because brain fossils are very few and far between. They do exist in some fossil sites that
How
are
is
like...
that possible?
Some fossil sites are incredible for their preservation. There are only a handful. But even as far back as the Cambrian period, about 530, 520 million years ago, we have fossil sites like the Burgess Shale up in Canada that is world famous for its soft body preservation. There's one specimen out of, I hesitate to say millions, at least tens of thousands of fossil specimens just from the Burgess Shale. So far, we have found a single brain.
Okay, question about this.
Yeah.
How much can you tell from a fossilized brain? Like, how useful to a paleontologist is a fossilized brain?
Depends exactly what kind of animal it's in. So the Burgess Shale, on top of being famous for its incredible preservation, is also famous for its really weird animals because it's early. Like, very early, before life kind of figured out the modern tracks that it went down for the rest of the history of life. So the brain that we have is from a very strange kind of arthropod-like thing. And we can tell that it's got the cluster in the head, and it's got the, tracts of nerves down the body along the belly. And at least from what I read, I am by no means, I'm not an expert on any brains, let alone invertebrate brains. From what I could tell, they could tell just by looking at the brain that the eyes were particularly important to this thing, which suggested it was probably a predator. Whatever parts of the arthropod brain are important for sight were clear enough to these researchers to be able to say that with some confidence. So, okay. I don't know how well that answers your question.
I mean, that, like, that useful enough. Like, in my mind, it's one of those things where just like what are you actually going to be able to tell from that? But I mean, that makes sense that there is still some utility to it.
Right. And like I said, this is weird. The group that this belonged to doesn't have any like living relatives today. I don't think any of its living relatives made it much farther out of the Cambrian. So it has nothing to compare it to all of that closely today. So just given that, it's hard to say what the brain was doing, but based on their understanding of modern arthropods, that's what it looked like to them. And so every now and then throughout the history of the fossil record, we get these great sites that even the best sites probably don't give us a brain. There's apparently a really great 3D preserved fish brain from a coal swamp fossil site in England from about 320 million years ago. From what I could tell, it looked pretty much like you'd expect a fish brain to look. At least in the snippets I read, it didn't say there was anything like super notable about it other than that it's a 320 million year old fish brain. We have a fossilized horseshoe crab brain from Illinois. Ooh. From about 300 million years old. And as you'd probably expect from a horseshoe crab, even the brain looked basically identical to modern horseshoe crab brains. I mean, the animals themselves haven't changed all that much in a few hundred million years, so
yeah,
sure,
makes sense that the brain wouldn't either. And I'm sure there are a couple of others, but those were the only ones I was really able to find a lot of information about. But much more common than actual brains, though, is we get casts of brain cases. So basically, the animal dies and is buried. The brain, wastes away and decays or whatever, and the space where the brain was is filled in with sediment and gives us like a loose shape of the brain, which even that can tell us a lot of different things about how the brain was structured. So for example, because of stuff like this, we know that T-Rex had like an incredible sense of smell. We have sediment casts of T-Rex brains, and the part that deals with smell is huge. And even if we don't get like a nice, like naturally formed sediment cast from the brain, sometimes if the skull is preserved well enough and not like crushed or flattened or anything, we can, make a cast ourselves using plaster or typically plaster, but sometimes other things. And we can do that and learn things from it the same way. And this is mostly how we know so much about how the brains of our ancestors developed. So we have basically no, pre-modern human brain and anything, but just by looking at the shape of the inside of the skull, you can tell where different parts of the brain were and how big they were relative to the other parts.
Neat.
Yeah. And so you don't need the brain itself to understand a lot of things about what the this is exclusively a vertebrate thing, really, because it's really hard to do that with like invertebrate fossils. But you can tell a lot of things about like, oh, this thing had great vision or a great sense of smell, or this may have been, a bit more of a social animal because, certain parts of the brain are bigger than others. All of that is, especially the social things, because that's more spread out than like the sense of smell or sense of sight or stuff like that. So that's a little more speculative, but you can make a lot of, reasonably confident inferences, even if you don't have the brain, if you have like a good skull. And so that's way oversimplified brains.
Nice.
Now, question here.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility that this could become more of a series for us and we can delve into more specific parts of the brain, or is this as far as we're going to get when it comes to the subject?
I mean, hypothetically, yeah, if people want. Like I said, I did about as much research as I wanted to.
Which is not as much research as he could have done, dear listener. But
yes, because there are definitely certain parts of the brain that are more interesting than others, or just have a more interesting like story than others. Like, for example, just one off the top of my head, not in my notes anywhere. The parts of the brain that control and process like sight are not at the front of the brain like you would think they should be, because that's where your eyes are. No, it's at the back. Why? I don't know. And I actually don't know if like science knows. Because there's not like an easy sort of like with that laryngeal nerve where it's like, oh, in fish, that's an easy answer. In fish, that made the most sense in them, and then that just stayed. At no point was the back of the brain at the front where the eyes are. I don't think anyway. But yeah, if people are clamoring, and or Mike and Fia are clamoring for more different parts of the brain, I can dig out my old psychology textbook. I'm sure I still have it, and or some healthy Googling.
I don't think it needs to be the next episode necessarily,
No.
but if we're looking for more ideas, we can definitely think about that. This has been I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive, episode 162. Things are going to be a little bit weird for the next little while, guys. So
Sure are.
Hang with us. The next time that I am talking on this podcast, there's a pretty good chance that that Gavin's going to have a new title.
I'm positive, because at least the way I'm thinking of it in my brain, segue,
well done.
You guys will not be back until episode 165 for a Fia Takes the Wheel.
So either you are a dad, or Liz is really, really unpleasant to be around because we're still waiting.
Dear God, if that is the case, in what would that be, a month and a half time? I feel like I will be dead. She will have killed me.
Oh no.
Yes.
She's really be taking the whole, oh yeah, humans should be pregnant for longer to heart. All right. But until then, thank you, listeners, for hanging with us and for going with us on this wonderful, weird journey. Were you and Liz dating at the start of this podcast?
Yes.
I think you guys had just started dating.
Yeah. Yeah, we were.
Yeah, and now here we are. And here we are going. And I hope that you come along with us. This has been episode 162 of I Wish You Were Dead. We'll talk to you guys whenever we get a chance to talk to you, but it might be a minute. Until then, have a great day. Take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.